What a shocker that the people who see everything through the lens of race and see their election loss as a result of racism and sexism.
Believe that racism and misogyny, they're just alive and well.
But that's not, it doesn't say I'm white, I voted for Donald Trump because of racism. That's not what stat. What stat are you talking about?
Someone must tell the usual suspects on the far left that the saying is, when you're in a hole, stop digging. You just lost a crazy contest to an actual crazy person. What a shocker that the people who see everything through the lens of race and see their election loss as a result of racism and sexism. Yes, if only we weren't so irredeemably unenlightened, we would have elected a black president by now. Oh, what, we did? Asked if racism is built into our society. White progressives agreed with that at higher levels than black and Hispanic people. They don't want your pity. And black people can't afford to indulge rich white people's need to endlessly flagellate themselves. They just want prices to go down and good jobs and the police when you call them.
Well, if he's right, then why didn't people vote for the former prosecutor who actually had policy plans to help the working class? I mean, you know, again, I got my popcorn. I don't know why people did what they did. I see all these reasons, and so, okay. Time will tell, but what do y'all think?
It all started with a segment that had jaws dropping across the internet. Bill Maher, never known for holding back, dropped a brutal truth bomb on national television. He called out the left's obsession with identity politics loud and clear, and it wasn't vague. He said Democrats keep blaming their election losses on racism and misogyny instead of looking in the mirror. That's not just throwing shade, that's tearing down the entire narrative that's dominated progressive media for years. He went further, mocking the idea that America is hopelessly racist, even pointing out that white progressives are the loudest voices on the topic, louder than the very communities they claim to defend. That hit a nerve, especially with The View, where things exploded faster than anyone expected. And here's the kicker. He said voters didn't reject Democrats because of skin color or gender, they just didn't buy what they were selling. That one sentence? It sent the internet into a frenzy.
I just, you know, I know that as a country, it's very difficult for people to believe that racism and misogyny, they're just alive and well. I think that we don't want to think that about ourselves, our neighbors, our friends, but it's my lived experience tells me that it does still exist, even if your lived experience doesn't tell you that it exists. And you know, the facts support that. I think we have a graph. If you look at there's a clear racial divide in who voted for Trump as opposed to who voted for Kamala Harris. It's very clear. It's not only clear by race, but it's also clear by education. And so the notion somehow that that is not true, this is by education. Those who attended college voted for her at a higher degree than those that didn't.
But I think
I've
you're
said that.
missing his point.
Let me just finish. And so I've said that before, and there was so much backlash because I think it's an uncomfortable, inconvenient truth about this country.
By the way, before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and share more intriguing stories. Now let's continue. This wasn't just another political hot take. This was a full-blown challenge to the progressive status quo. And what came next on live TV turned a heated debate into something way more personal. Because when Bill Maher spoke out, Sunny Hostin didn't just push back, she erupted. And what happened on The View next? Well, that's where the real drama began.
His whole point is they didn't vote for him because of racism and misogyny. They voted for him because they felt like, I think the biggest common denominator in this election is people want a good life and ability to provide for their family.
Well,
and whether we agree or not with Donald Trump's plans,
black people
they thought that he was reflective.
One of the poorest demographics in this country, but they voted for Kamala Harris.
But there was a split, and more of them voted for Donald Trump than had historically. I think that there's such a desire. If you really think the vast majority of this country voted because of racism and misogyny, you're missing it. Most of my family, a lot of my family doesn't have college degrees.
But the stats are the stats.
But that's not, it doesn't say I'm white, I voted for Donald Trump because of racism. That's not, let me just, what stat are you talking about?
Let me just dissect.
Yes, you can. There's a lot
Hold on, calm down. Everybody just take a breath. Take a breath.
Sunny Hostin didn't waste a second. As soon as Maher's comments were brought up, she went into full defense mode, ready to throw punches verbally, of course. She claimed racism and misogyny absolutely shaped the election results, and made it clear that anyone who thought otherwise was ignoring lived experiences, especially hers. The tone shifted, fast. Suddenly, it wasn't about political analysis anymore, it was personal. She wasn't just debating a guest's opinion, she was fighting for what she believed to be an undeniable truth. The room got tense. Words flew, interruptions, raised voices. You could feel the tension crawling through the screen.
He says that folks see everything through the lens of racism and racism. Not everything, but if you're not seeing racism and racism in America, then you need to clean your lenses.
But yeah.
Because, this is something that I also find interesting, that when Democrats and liberals talk about racism, it's immediately labeled as identity politics, which has a negative connotation. It's a term that Republicans have coined, and it's been very effective. But when Donald Trump goes to Miami and talks to Cubans, that's not identity politics. When Donald Trump goes to Dearborn, Michigan and promises Arabs something, that's not identity politics. When he goes to Jews and promises them the opposite, that's not identity politics.
So I think it's important.
That's when Whoopi Goldberg had to jump in literally just to stop it from turning into a full-on meltdown on national TV. She tried to play the peacemaker, calming everyone down. But even she looked rattled. And let's be real, when Whoopi is rattled, you know the table's on fire. But here's where it got even crazier. Beneath all the shouting, the ratings for The View were quietly plummeting. Behind the scenes, the panic button had already been pressed. Executives were watching, not just worried about Sunny's outbursts, but about what all of this was doing to their audience. Because Maher didn't just call them out. He did it during a time when The View was already struggling to hold on to its influence. And whether Sunny realized it or not, this on-air meltdown wasn't helping. It was exposing something much deeper and far more uncomfortable. Now here's where things really started to unravel. Bill Maher doubled down, in this time. He didn't just criticize The View. He went straight for the jugular, saying that the far left needed to stop digging. In his words, they didn't just lose an election. They lost a crazy contest to someone even crazier, brutal. Then he hit them where it hurts most, the obsession with race and oppression. He pointed out that many white progressives believe racism is built into every layer of American society more than Black or Hispanic people believe it. Let that sink in. According to Maher, the people screaming the loudest about racism are often the ones who've never experienced it directly. And then came the line that really lit the fuse. Black people can't afford to indulge rich white liberals' need to endlessly self-flagellate. In other words, your guilt isn't helping anyone. They don't want pity. They want real things: jobs, safety, affordable groceries, not lectures. That message hit hard. It completely flipped the narrative. Instead of saying voters were driven by hate, Maher was saying they were driven by survival. People want a good life. They want the basics. And when politicians ignore that in favor of endless virtue signaling, they lose touch and lose votes. That wasn't just commentary. That was a direct challenge to the core of what progressive media had been pushing for years. And for The View, that challenge wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. At this point, things started getting really awkward on The View. You could see it in their face, especially Sunny Hostin. She tried to bring it back to policy, saying voters should have chosen the former prosecutor with actual plans to help the working class. Of course, she meant Kamala Harris. But here's the problem. Maher's point had already cut through all that. Someone on the panel sarcastically chimed in, "I've got my popcorn," as if they knew what was coming next. And what came next was a dose of reality that couldn't be brushed aside. The moment anyone criticized identity politics, Sunny and others flipped it around and claimed Republicans were doing the same thing. It was a game of deflection, but it wasn't landing the same anymore. Then they tried to defend Kamala Harris's record, but it was shaky. Even if you gave her the benefit of the doubt, she had her shot. She was already vice president. She already had the chance to deliver. And what did people see? Promises, not results. That's the core issue Maher was pointing to. So the big question became, why should voters roll the dice again on someone who had power and didn't use it effectively, especially when prices were rising, jobs were uncertain, and crime was spiking? The crowd wasn't asking for perfection, they just wanted something real. And this wasn't it. The panel kept talking, but the audience was already thinking, maybe it's not that complicated after all. Maybe people just want to live a decent life, and all this finger-pointing isn't cutting it anymore. Then Sunny made it even more emotional. She leaned into her personal experience, saying racism and misogyny are still alive and well in America, whether people want to admit it or not. She said most people don't want to believe that their neighbors or coworkers could be racist, but for her, it's something she's felt directly. And she brought receipts charts, graphs, stats. One graph showed a racial divide in voting patterns. More college-educated people supported Kamala Harris, while less educated voters leaned toward Trump. She insisted that this breakdown proved the country was still deeply biased, not just by race, but by class and education. But that's where the pushback came in hard. Critics of this argument didn't just disagree, they said the entire framing was flawed. Just because voters without college degrees supported Trump didn't mean they were racist. It could mean they're broke. It could mean they feel ignored. It could mean they just didn't trust the promises they'd been hearing for years. And then came the knockout blow: Joe Biden's own numbers from the 2020 election. He's a white man with a long trail of questionable racial comments, including the infamous, "If you don't vote for me, you ain't black." And he still outperformed Kamala Harris. That fact alone shattered Sunny's argument. If racism was the driving force, how did Biden do better than a black woman? The answer wasn't identity. It was something else entirely, something the panel didn't want to face. That something else was finally laid bare. People didn't vote based on race or gender, they voted based on survival. Maher pointed out that what united voters in this chaotic election wasn't hatred, but desperation. Inflation was crushing families, rent was out of control, groceries were sky high, and people were just trying to keep their heads above water. So, when politicians like Kamala Harris talked about identity but not about rent or jobs, voters tuned out. Maher said it plain. Voters want to provide for their families. They want stability, safety, a future. Not lectures about privilege from people who live in gated neighborhoods and drive luxury cars to climate rallies. Even in communities that had historically leaned left, like working-class Black and Hispanic neighborhoods, there was a noticeable shift. More people voted Republican this time than ever before. Not because they suddenly became conservatives, but because the Democratic Party stopped speaking their language. And when Sunny fired back with stats again, insisting the numbers prove voters chose racism, it just didn't land. One of the co-hosts tried to calm things down, saying, "Let's just take a breath." But it was too late. The damage was done. The argument had spiraled out of control. Sunny wasn't budging. Her mind was made up. For her, this was only about racism and misogyny. No amount of data could change that. But for millions watching, especially those who just wanted to know how to pay their next bill, that narrative wasn't just out of touch. It felt like a distraction. And that's exactly where the divide became crystal clear. While Sunny Hostin kept circling back to discrimination and prejudice, others were saying enough. This election wasn't lost because voters were hateful. It was lost because the party misread the room. Big time. Bill Maher said it straight. The issues that mattered most were the economy and immigration. That's it. And instead of addressing those head-on, Democrats leaned deeper into identity politics. They ignored their own voters. They brushed aside the things people were actually talking about at home, like rent hikes, job insecurity, and overwhelmed border towns. And it showed. Loud and clear. Even moderate voters felt abandoned. The ones who used to lean blue started feeling like their concerns weren't welcome anymore. They didn't see themselves in the message. And if you've ever felt like the people in charge are too busy arguing over social buzzwords to fix real problems, that's exactly what this moment was about. Maher wasn't saying racism doesn't exist. He made that clear. But he was saying it wasn't the deciding factor this time, and obsessing over it while ignoring bread and butter issues. That's what lost votes. That's what flipped districts. That's what handed wins to candidates who barely even had a ground game. So, when the View panel kept dragging the conversation back to labels and blame, the disconnect got louder. The voters had already moved on. They were asking a different question. Who's actually listening to us? And the silence from their own side? That was deafening. Now, this is where the conversation took a sharp turn in. It hit right at the heart of progressive messaging. Sunny and the panel kept saying that when Democrats talk about racism, it's dismissed as identity politics. But when Republicans go to Cuban neighborhoods in Miami, or Arab communities in Dearborn, or speak directly to Jewish voters, it's seen as smart strategy. Why the double standard? That question exploded on the table. But then someone dropped a line that made the whole room pause. When Republicans do it, it actually comes off as genuine. That wasn't just a jab, that was a gut punch to the entire Democratic brand. Because here's what they meant when Trump showed up in those communities: people felt like he was actually talking to them, not talking down to them. He wasn't wrapped in elite language or woke slogans. He was blunt, direct, practical, and whether you loved him or hated him, he showed up where Republicans usually don't even bother. That alone made a huge impact. Compare that to Kamala Harris. Maher said she was a weak candidate, too polished, too rehearsed, too vulnerable. Her campaign didn't feel authentic. It felt scripted. And in politics, that's deadly, especially when people are struggling and looking for someone who feels real. So attacking her weaknesses wasn't cruelty. It was strategy. In a game like politics, you don't play nice, you go for the weak spots. And according to this argument, Harris had a lot of them. Then came the most uncomfortable truth of allies, racism, and misogyny exist in America. No one's denying that. And sure, there are voters out there who do see the world through that ugly lens. But was that the deciding factor in this election? No, not even close. Maher broke it down with brutal clarity. Kamala Harris didn't lose because she's a woman or because she's black. She lost because she ran a contradictory, uninspiring campaign at the worst possible time. Inflation was breaking people, gas prices were painful, immigration was a mess, crime was rising, and America's foreign policy? An embarrassment. Voters were overwhelmed. So when Harris stood on stage and promised hope and equity, it sounded hollow, because behind her were years of unmet promises and skyrocketing living costs. She was part of the incumbent administration. She had power and things still got worse. That's what voters remembered. Maher asked the obvious question no one on The View wanted to touch. Why ignore the real reasons she lost? Why obsess over identity when the facts were staring everyone in the face? But Sunny wouldn't budge. She kept framing it as bigotry. Meanwhile, the actual problems, the economy, border chaos, broken cities were getting ignored right there on live TV. That moment exposed something raw, a refusal to accept that the problem might not be the voters. It might be the messages and the messengers. To really drive the point home, Maher brought out the receipts' actual data that undercut everything the View panel had been preaching. First up, a chart showing how different groups feel about America. 75% of Hispanic Americans and 58% of Black Americans said they believe the U.S. is the greatest country in the world. But white progressives? Only 31% agreed. Think about that. The very people constantly claiming to speak for minorities actually see the country less favorably than the people living in those communities. That's not awareness, that's disconnect. Then came the next blow. Another chart showing belief in systemic racism. Hispanic agreement? 38%. Black Americans? 62%. White progressives? 75%. Again, white progressives topping the list. The ones who preach the loudest are often the most out of touch. And the final chart? A question about increasing border security. 49% of Hispanics supported tighter border control, but only 15% of white progressives agreed. That gap was the final nail. The very people the left claims to defend want stronger borders. They want law and order. But the party that's supposed to represent them is ignoring that entirely because their loudest voices are coming from rich, educated, elite bubbles that don't reflect the lived experience of working-class minorities. This wasn't just a miscalculation, it was political suicide. And Maher laid it all out in black and white. And then, boom, the internet lit up. Progressive Twitter, or rather its younger, edgier cousin Blue Sky, went into full meltdown mode. The reaction to Maher's segment wasn't just angry, it was unhinged. People weren't posting counter-arguments, they were just unloading pure rage. One person wrote, "God, I hate Bill Maher." That was the whole post. No facts, no reasoning, just hatred. Another one, "Bill Maher is a dumb with horrible political analysis." Again, no attempt to argue, just insult and scroll. They weren't debating ideas, they were having a tantrum. One post screamed, "So sick of these white men telling Dems how to run the party." Another claimed that Maher was just pushing Democrats to ignore the base and center the dude bros. But here's what all those posts missed. The base is changing, fast. People are tired of the same recycled talking points, tired of being told how to think, tired of feeling like their real problems are being buried under slogans and hashtags. And that headline that caused the biggest stir? Bill Maher, "Stupid Dems need to ditch identity politics." Simple, brutal, but to millions of voters it sounded like truth. The kind of truth you're not allowed to say out loud on cable news without getting torched. But Maher said it anyway. And the reaction proved just how fragile that entire political strategy has become. The outrage didn't hurt his point, it confirmed it. But the backlash didn't stop there. The final straw came when progressives tried to defend the Democratic Party's messaging listing off everything they believed was offered to voters. Reduced taxes, protection of Social Security, affordable health care, defense of constitutional rights, even claiming it was the best economy in the world. Sounds impressive, right? But there was a massive problem. Voters didn't feel any of it. Those promises didn't touch the three biggest issues people cared about: cost of living, immigration, and crime. Not even close. People weren't checking policy lists, they were checking gas prices. They were wondering why rent was 2 weeks' pay and why their neighborhoods felt less safe. And while the Democrats were talking about abstract rights, voters were living through real-life chaos. Maher pointed out something painfully obvious. None of those talking points cracked the top concerns in the polls. Abortion and foreign policy barely made the list. Everything else didn't even register. It wasn't that voters didn't care. It was that they were drowning and didn't see a lifeline from the people in power. So when Maher asked his audience to consider the real reason Democrats were losing ground, he didn't blame the voters. He blamed the strategy, the obsession with pleasing the loudest voices online, the refusal to adjust, the arrogance. And then he ended with a question that left everyone watching with something to chew on. What's really been the downfall of the Democratic Party? For him, it was clear. The progressives hijacked the wheel. And now, even lifelong Democrats are looking around wondering, what happened to us? If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Also, drop your thoughts in the comments. See you on the next one.